Welcome back to Mr. Crimeshow. In this episode, I've gathered 8 chilling true crime stories, each one more unsettling than the last. With steady rain sounds and a black screen to create the perfect atmosphere, you can relax, focus, or fall asleep while listening. If you enjoy these stories, don't forget to subscribe and share where you're tuning in from in the comments. When a 12-year-old's actions changed everything. On a quiet day in March 2023, 3 teenagers would have no idea their lives were about to be cut tragically short. By April 1st, their bodies would be discovered in the rural Ocklawaha area of Marion County, Florida, and the person responsible was someone they likely trusted completely. He was just 12 years old, barely out of elementary school, and his name was Christopher Atkins. Christopher's story began like many others in Marion County, where families often struggled with challenges that stretched beyond their front doors. His mother had faced her own legal troubles, and when deputies came to search their home following the events that would change everything, she was arrested on an outstanding warrant. The household wasn't stable, and Christopher had been having difficulties at school for some time. Those closest to him described a boy who was easily manipulated, and a little bit slow, someone who seemed to follow rather than lead. In the months leading up to the tragedy, Christopher had become friends with 2 older teenagers, Robert Robinson and Taj Bruton. Robinson was 17 and Bruton was 16. Both were significantly older than Christopher, and the dynamic between the 3 boys would prove to be a devastating combination. The friendship developed during a time when Christopher was particularly vulnerable, searching for acceptance and belonging in a world that often felt confusing and overwhelming to him. The boys spent time together regularly, and what started as typical teenage activities gradually shifted into something much darker. By late March 2023, conversations had turned to plans that no child should ever consider. The 3 had decided to commit an armed robbery, and they had identified their targets. What made this decision so heartbreaking was that the victims they chose weren't strangers. They were friends, people who trusted them completely. 16-year-old Layla Silvernail was a bright young woman with her whole life ahead of her. She had dreams and plans, and a grandmother who loved her deeply. 17-year-old Michael Hodo Jr. was known for his kindness and had a family who cherished him. 16-year-old Camille Qualls was beloved by her godmother and many others who saw her potential and spirit. These 3 teenagers had no reason to fear Christopher, Robert, or Taj. They were friends, or at least friendly acquaintances, which made what was about to happen even more unthinkable. The plan was simple but deadly. The boys would approach their victims under the pretense of friendship, then rob them at gunpoint. What they didn't anticipate, or perhaps didn't care to consider, was how quickly things could spiral beyond their control. On the evening that changed everything, the 3 boys met with Layla, Michael, and Camille in what the victims believed was a social gathering. Christopher later confessed that he and his co-defendants carried out the armed robbery as planned. But somewhere during the encounter, the situation escalated in the worst possible way. Investigators would later piece together a sequence of events that was both methodical and chaotic. Michael Hodo Jr. lost his life due to the actions of the group while inside a vehicle. The act was intentional, and the 17-year-old had no chance to protect himself. Camille Qualls endured an even more terrifying ordeal. She was forced into the trunk of Layla's car, where Christopher and Robert Robinson harmed her twice before she lost her life, trapped in a space where she couldn't escape and couldn't call for help. The memory of her final moments stayed with investigators and would later bring the courtroom to tears. Layla Silvernail, meanwhile, was struck in the head and left for dead near a dumpster. Unlike the others, she initially survived the attack, clinging to life as her body fought against the severe trauma. She was discovered barely breathing and was rushed to a hospital, where medical teams did everything they could to save her. For a brief moment, there was hope that she might recover, but the damage was too severe. Layla lost her life due to her injuries, becoming the final victim of a crime that had spiraled completely out of control. After the shootings, the three boys faced the terrifying reality of what they had done. In a panic, they attempted to dispose of the evidence and cover their tracks. They moved Michael's remains from the vehicle and placed him along the side of a road, as if he had been the victim of some other type of incident. Camille's remains were left in the trunk of Layla's car, which they then drove to a secluded pond in the Ocklawaha area. The car was pushed into the water, partially submerging it in what they hoped would hide the evidence forever. Christopher later admitted to investigators that he helped attempt to move Camille's remains from the submerged trunk, but the task proved too difficult. The boys fled the scene in a state of panic, running through the woods as the weight of their actions began to settle in. Back at Christopher's home, the three boys burned their clothes, trying to eliminate any physical evidence that might connect them to the crime. Christopher would later tell investigators that they spent the next few days in a state of constant fear, knowing that the bodies would eventually be discovered and that their lives as they knew them were over. The discovery of the victims happened over several days in late March and early April 2023. Each finding brought fresh horror to the community and the families involved. When Layla was found near the dumpster, barely clinging to life, emergency responders worked frantically to save her. The discovery of Michael's remains along the roadside initially puzzled investigators, who weren't immediately sure if the two incidents were connected. It wasn't until Layla's partially submerged vehicle was found, with Camille's remains in the trunk, that the full scope of the tragedy became clear. Marion County Sheriff Billy Woods would later describe the investigation as one of the most disturbing his department had handled. The age of the perpetrators, combined with the severity of the crimes, left even experienced investigators struggling to understand how such young people could commit such devastating acts. The arrests came quickly once the investigation focused on Christopher, Robert, and Taj. Christopher, despite being only 12 years old, was charged as an adult with first-degree murder, armed robbery, tampering with evidence, and battery. The decision to charge him as an adult was controversial, but reflected the serious nature of the crimes and the deliberate planning involved. During questioning, Christopher eventually confessed to his role in the killings and the armed robbery. He was able to corroborate the sequence of events that investigators had pieced together, providing details that only someone present could have known. His confession was crucial in understanding exactly what had happened during those terrible hours. The legal proceedings that followed were emotionally charged and complex. Christopher's defense team worked to present him as a vulnerable child who had been influenced by older, more sophisticated criminals. They brought in Dr. Barbara Russell, a counselor who testified that Christopher had elevated levels of lead in his blood and had been raised in an environment where his mother's ability to advocate for his needs seemed weak. The defense painted a picture of a boy who was easily manipulated and had been failed by the adults in his life. Christopher's family members also testified on his behalf. His older cousin offered a direct apology to the victims' families and asked for leniency, citing Christopher's difficult upbringing and the challenges he had faced from an early age. The family described a household where stability was rare and where Christopher often struggled to receive the guidance and support he needed. But the victims' families had their own powerful testimony to share. Lisa Windsor, Layla Silvernail's grandmother, delivered an emotional impact statement that brought tears to the eyes of everyone present. "I am just broken," she told the court, her voice heavy with grief. "Here Papa and I were already not in good health, and now this heartbreak feels like it's slowly killing us from the inside out. The pain never ends. It never stops." Her words captured the devastating impact that Christopher's actions had on innocent people who had done nothing to deserve such tragedy. During the same emotional testimony, Windsor addressed Christopher directly, saying, "Those boys decided to play God. May God forgive me that the boys who did this are haunted every day by what they've done." Her statement reflected the complex emotions surrounding the case, where grief and anger mixed with the recognition that the perpetrator was still just a child. Christina Stewart, Camille's godmother, spoke about the conflicting emotions she felt sitting in the courtroom. "I see a 12-year-old boy in there who potentially could have the rest of his life ahead of him, but I also see the kid who shot and killed Camille, and I feel very conflicted," she said. Her words highlighted the difficult reality of a justice system trying to balance accountability with the recognition that children, even those who commit terrible crimes, are different from adult offenders. In April 2023, Christopher agreed to testify against his co-defendants, Robert Robinson and Taj Bruton, as part of a plea deal. This decision meant that he would provide detailed testimony about the planning and execution of the crimes in exchange for a potentially reduced sentence. The agreement required him to be completely honest about his role and the roles of others, holding nothing back regardless of how damaging the truth might be. When Christopher's own sentencing hearing arrived, he attempted to give a statement on his own behalf. Initially, he appeared to be following a prepared script, but he quickly deviated from whatever his attorneys had planned. In rushed, broken speech, he asked for another chance, insisting that he had a future and wanted to prove he wasn't the person he was being portrayed as. "You think I'm bad, I'm not," he said, his voice filled with emotion. "I promise if you give me another chance, I'm good." He spoke about wanting to influence others not to take the path he had taken and to tell them to cherish their families. However, Christopher's statement was notably lacking in acknowledgement of the victims' families' pain. He barely mentioned the suffering he had caused, focusing instead on his own desire for redemption. The families in the courtroom were left shaking their heads at his words, feeling that he still didn't fully understand the magnitude of what he had done. His attorney eventually cut him off, recognizing that the statement was not helping his case. The prosecution asked the court for more than the minimum mandatory sentence of 40 years in prison. While they acknowledged that Christopher was the least culpable of the three defendants due to his age and the influence of older co-defendants, they argued that he knew his actions would lead to serious consequences when he decided to rob someone at gunpoint. They emphasized that even a 12-year-old understands the difference between right and wrong, especially when it comes to pointing a gun at another person. Christopher's attorney asked for the minimum sentence of 40 years, with concurrent sentences for his lesser charges. They continued to emphasize his youth, his troubled background, and the manipulative influence of older defendants who should have known better than to involve a child in such serious crimes. The judge faced an incredibly difficult decision. He had to balance the severity of the crimes with Christopher's young age at the time they were committed. In announcing his decision, the judge made clear that he would not hold Christopher directly responsible for the loss of life suffered by Michael Hodo and Layla Silvernail, since Christopher had not personally fired the shots that ended their lives. However, he acknowledged that this decision would cause anguish among the victims' families, who felt that all three defendants should be held equally responsible. Ultimately, the judge sentenced Christopher to serve 40 years in prison, with credit for 798 days already served while awaiting trial. He cited Christopher's young age as the biggest factor in his decision, while the victims' families sobbed in the courtroom. Christopher will be eligible for sentence review after 25 years, meaning he could potentially be released while still in his 30s. The sentencing of Christopher Atkins represented just the beginning of the legal resolution. His co-defendants, Taj Bruton and Robert Robinson, were sentenced the following day to life in prison, reflecting their greater culpability as older defendants who should have exercised better judgment. All three had been charged as adults, but only Christopher received a sentence that offered any possibility of eventual freedom. State Attorney Bill Gladson spoke after all three sentences were finalized, saying, "Justice demanded nothing less than full accountability." These convictions honor the stolen lives of Layla, Michael, and Camille, while affirming that no one, regardless of age, may take the life of another without facing the gravest consequences. The case of Christopher Atkins raised difficult questions about juvenile justice, the influence of older criminals on vulnerable children, and the capacity for rehabilitation even after the most serious crimes. His story serves as a tragic reminder that violence affects everyone it touches, including those who perpetrate it, and that the consequences of a few terrible decisions can echo through countless lives for decades to come. The families of Layla Silvernail, Michael Hodo Jr., and Camille Quarles will carry their grief forever, their lives forever altered by actions that took just moments but caused immeasurable pain. Their memory deserves to be honored, and their loss serves as a stark reminder of the preciousness of life and the devastating consequences when that life is taken away too soon. The Laurie hacking case, when deception led to an unthinkable loss. 27-year-old Laurie K. Soares hacking walked into that convenience store with her husband Mark on the evening of July 18, 2004, completely unaware it would be the last time anyone would see her alive. She was a stockbroker's assistant at Wells Fargo, 5 weeks pregnant, and planning a move to North Carolina where she believed her husband was about to begin medical school. She had given notice at work and was preparing for what she thought would be a new chapter in their life together. But everything Laurie believed about her future was built on a foundation of lies that was about to crumble completely. Laurie's story began in Fullerton, California, where she was adopted by Thelma and Iraldo Soares. Iraldo was a Spanish and Portuguese teacher at Sunny Hills High School and a native of Brazil who had met Thelma while they both served as missionaries for the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints in Rio de Janeiro. When Laurie's parents divorced in 1987, she and her mother moved to Orem, Utah, where Laurie would attend Orem High School and eventually meet the man who would become her husband. Mark Douglas Hacking seemed like the perfect match. He came from a family that valued education deeply. His father, Douglas Hacking, was a pediatrician, his mother was a nurse, and his brothers had successful careers in science. Mark and Laurie married in 1999, and to everyone who knew them, they appeared to have a happy, loving marriage. The trouble began years before anyone realized it. Mark had been living a carefully constructed lie that grew more elaborate with each passing day. While his family believed he was attending the University of Utah, he had actually dropped out in 2002. Yet he continued the charade with remarkable dedication, pretending to attend classes, studying textbooks, and even writing what appeared to be term papers. He traveled across the country to fake interviews at different medical schools, creating such a detailed persona that no one suspected the truth. Dr. Kathy Yates, a forensic psychologist, later explained how someone could maintain such an elaborate deception. He was able to deceive with such detailed accuracy in terms of creating a persona that he wanted everybody to believe, and that tells me he's bright. If somebody's clever and crosses their T's and dots their I's, and they are in healthy relationships with people, it will be very hard for those closest to them to not be deceived. The house of cards began to collapse on Friday, July 16, 2004. Laurie, excited about the upcoming move and possibly concerned about financial matters due to her pregnancy, called the University of North Carolina Medical School to ask about financial aid. What she heard devastated her. The administrator told her that Mark had not enrolled in medical school and, in fact, had never even applied. Co-workers watched as Laurie broke down in tears and left work early that day. But that evening, at a going-away party thrown in her honor, Laurie seemed content again. Mark had once again managed to smooth things over, telling her that a computer problem at the school was responsible for not including him on the incoming student roster. Trusting her husband, Laurie called the school after hours and left a message stating that Mark had straightened everything out. Because it was after 5 p.m. on the East Coast, no one would hear that message until Monday, July 19, when Laurie would already be gone. The morning of July 19, 2004, began like any other. At 7 a.m., Mark Hacking made his first call to Salt Lake City police, reporting that his wife had not returned from her customary morning jog in the Memory Grove and City Creek Canyon area. He called again at 10:46 a.m., this time saying he had found Laurie's car parked near the canyon. To everyone watching, Mark appeared to be a worried husband desperately searching for his missing wife. He spoke to television cameras with apparent gratitude for the volunteers who stepped up to help search for Laurie. But investigators quickly noticed details that didn't add up. While Mark claimed to be searching for his wife between his 2 calls to police, they discovered he had actually been out buying a new mattress. When they searched the couple's apartment, they found Laurie's purse, wallet, and car keys inside. More troubling was the discovery of a hunting knife with suspicious markings on it in their bedroom. The driver's seat in Laurie's car had been adjusted for someone much taller than Laurie, and there were signs of a struggle in the back seat. In the early morning hours of July 20, everything fell apart for Mark. Police received a disturbance call reporting that he was running around outside a hotel wearing nothing but sandals. He was admitted to a psychiatric facility, though former FBI profiler Candice DeLong later noted something telling. He kept his shoes on, his sandals. That's not generally something we see in someone truly psychotic. By July 21, the devastating truth about Mark's lies became clear to both families. Not only had he never been accepted to medical school, but he had also lied about graduating from the University of Utah in 2004. The revelation stunned everyone who knew him. His father, Douglas Hacking, later said, "We were under the impression that Mark had been accepted to medical school and just found out a few minutes ago he never even applied to medical school at North Carolina." The family that had always valued education and achievement was reeling from the discovery that their son and brother had been living a complete fabrication. On July 24, while Mark remained in the psychiatric facility, his brothers Scott and Lance visited him. They encouraged him to tell the truth about what had happened to Laurie. In what would become the most crucial moment in the case, Mark finally confessed. He told his brothers that on the night of July 18, he and Laurie had argued after he revealed the truth about medical school. Later that night, as she slept, he used a firearm to end her life while she was in bed. He then wrapped her in carpet and placed everything in a dumpster. The brothers immediately shared Mark's confession with his attorney, who then informed police. On August 2, Mark was arrested and charged with first-degree murder on August 9. His father, Douglas Hacking, tried to make sense of what had happened, telling reporters, "I think it's clear that this whole house of cards he had built, all this deception, had come to an end. He had been found out. His wife discovered his deception and confronted him with it, and I just think he just saw his whole world collapsing and broke down. He just snapped and did something there's no explanation for." For 2 long months, searchers combed through the Salt Lake County landfill looking for any trace of Laurie. On October 1, 2004, at approximately 8:20 a.m., they finally found remains. By that afternoon, police confirmed that they had found Laurie. The discovery brought both relief and renewed anguish to her family, who had been waiting for the chance to properly lay her to rest. On October 29, 2004, despite pleas from Laurie's brother Paul Soares to save your family the grief and cost and plead guilty, Mark initially pleaded not guilty to first-degree murder. But as the evidence mounted and the reality of his situation became clear, Mark changed his plea. On April 15, 2005, he pleaded guilty to first-degree murder in exchange for prosecutors dropping other charges. The sentencing hearing on June 6, 2005, was filled with raw emotion as both families addressed the court. Mark's family went first, with each member expressing their love and support for Mark, while offering their deepest condolences to the Soares family. Douglas Hacking, speaking as both a father and a physician, told the court, "I hate what he did and would give my life to reverse what happened, but I still love him." When Mark addressed the courtroom, his words were devastating in their honesty. "Words are cheap, especially coming from me," he said, "but from the bottom of my heart, I'm so sorry for the pain I've caused." He continued with heavy detail. "She was the greatest thing that ever happened to me, but I took her life and the life of my unborn child and placed them in the garbage, and I can't explain why I did it. I put them in the garbage, and they were lost in the landfill." His voice breaking, he added, "I deserve to be in prison probably for the rest of my life, and I'm okay with that. I'll never feel I've served enough time. Laurie's mother, Thelma Soares, took the stand with tremendous dignity despite her overwhelming grief. Words fail me as I try to express how my soul has been ripped apart, she said. She described the horror of learning how her daughter had lost her life. After Mark ended her life, he placed her and her child into the city trash. She spoke of the months Laurie's remains had lain under 9 tons of waste in the landfill, and how searchers had found only a fraction of her daughter's body. I cannot bear to see a garbage truck now, she said. Looking directly at Mark, she concluded, I can't think of one good reason why Mark should ever walk free again in his lifetime. Judge Denise Lindbergh sentenced Mark to 6 years to life in prison, the maximum sentence possible under Utah law at the time. However, the judge noted that the Utah Board of Pardons and Parole would ultimately decide how long Mark would actually serve. In July 2005, that board declared that Mark would not be considered for parole until at least 2035, meaning he would serve a minimum of 30 years. Board Chairman Mike Sibbett stressed that Mark's obstruction of justice by disposing of Laurie's remains and falsely reporting her missing were aggravating factors that merited the extended sentence. The case's impact extended far beyond the courtroom. The initial 6-year minimum sentence had caused public outrage, with many people expressing alarm that Mark could potentially be released so quickly. This led to legislative action. On March 20, 2006, Utah House Bill 102, known as Laurie's Law, was signed into law, requiring that people convicted of first-degree murder serve at least 15 years before being considered for parole. On June 6, 2005, Mark's father read what he said would be their family's final public statement about the case. The statement ended with words from Mark himself. I know prison is where I need to be. I will spend my time there doing all I can to right the many wrongs I have done, though I realize complete atonement is impossible in this life. There is no such thing as a harmless lie, no matter how small it is. You may think a lie only hurts the liar, but this is far from the truth. If you are traveling a path of lies, please stop now and face the consequences. Whatever those consequences, they will be better than the pain you are causing yourself and others. Investigation revealed that Laurie may have been trying to save her marriage even as she discovered the extent of Mark's deceptions. A typewritten letter from Laurie to Mark was found in their spare bedroom, though its exact date remains unknown. In it, she pleaded with her husband to change, writing, I want to grow old with you, but I can't do it under these conditions. I can't imagine life with you if things don't change. Her brother Paul later said of their relationship, he didn't have to be a doctor, a president, whatever it was. As long as he was doing his best, she would have loved him. The Soares family made the difficult decision to remove the name Hacking from Laurie's headstone, replacing her married name with the Portuguese word Filhinha, meaning little daughter. We just felt that Mark obviously didn't want her anymore, her mother explained. In Laurie's honor, the family established the Laurie K. Soares Hacking Memorial Scholarship at the University of Utah's David Eccles School of Business, helping women in disadvantaged situations and those facing personal challenges. Years later, Thelma Soares would say she had exchanged letters with Mark in prison and had forgiven him for her own peace of mind. But the grief remained constant. You never get over it, she said in a 2014 interview. I'm not over it now. I will never get over it. What you get over is the immediacy of it, but you never get over the loss. Through her unimaginable pain, she had also found an unexpected source of comfort in Mark's family, who had embraced her as their own. As she recalled through tears, one of Mark's brothers had told her at Laurie's memorial service, Thelma, I hope you know you've just got 6 more children. The tragedy of Laurie Hacking's death serves as a heartbreaking reminder of how lies, even those told with the intention of protecting loved ones, can spiral into something unthinkably destructive. Laurie lost her life due to the actions of someone she trusted completely, someone she had planned to spend her life with, someone she was willing to forgive and stand by even when she discovered his deceptions. Her memory lives on through the scholarship established in her name and through the law that bears her legacy, ensuring that others who commit such acts face appropriate consequences. Our hearts remain with Laurie's family, who continue to carry the weight of this immeasurable loss, while honoring the memory of a young woman whose life was taken far too soon. The story of Kelsey Smith, a life cut short in Overland Park. On the warm Saturday evening of June 2, 2007, 18-year-old Kelsey Ann Smith of Overland Park, Kansas, was filled with excitement about a special anniversary. She had been dating her boyfriend John Beersmith for 6 months, and she wanted to find him the perfect gift to celebrate their relationship. Kelsey, who had just graduated from Shawnee Mission West High School and was preparing to attend Kansas State University in the fall, told her parents she would be heading to Target to shop for something special. She was a bright, vibrant young woman with her whole future ahead of her, living with her parents Greg and Missy Smith in their close-knit family home. Her father, Greg Smith, was a former law enforcement officer who had transitioned into teaching in the Shawnee Mission School District. Greg was also pursuing his career in public service, having plans to run for state representative in the years ahead. Missy Smith was devoted to their daughter and the family they had built together. The Smith household was one filled with love, hope, and dreams for Kelsey's bright future as she prepared to begin her college journey. At approximately 6:30 in the evening, Kelsey left her family home and drove her 1987 Buick Regal to the Target store located at 97th and Quivira, behind Oak Park Mall in Overland Park. She was planning to spend about an hour shopping before returning home for her special date with John. Everything seemed perfectly normal as she parked her car and walked into the busy store, unaware that someone was watching her every move. Inside Target, surveillance cameras captured Kelsey's routine shopping trip in remarkable detail. The footage showed her selecting items carefully, making a phone call to her mother from inside the store to check in, and browsing the aisles with the focused attention of someone looking for just the right gift. What the cameras also revealed, however, was something far more sinister. A white male in his early 20s, wearing a white shirt and dark shorts, had entered the store approximately 30 seconds after Kelsey. This man appeared in nearly every aisle that Kelsey visited, maintaining what investigators would later describe as a discreet but persistent distance. The stranger never attempted to approach Kelsey or speak with her during her time in the store. Instead, he observed her movements carefully, following her path through the store while avoiding direct contact. Store employees noticed nothing unusual about Kelsey's behavior that evening, and she appeared calm and focused on her shopping. When Kelsey finished her purchases and headed to the cashier, the mysterious man left the store just as she went to pay for her items. The parking lot surveillance footage would later prove to be the key to understanding what happened next, though it took investigators multiple viewings to detect the critical moments. At first glance, the video appeared to show nothing unusual as Kelsey walked to her car with her purchases. However, when the footage was slowed down and enhanced, it revealed a flash in the direction of Kelsey and her vehicle, consistent with someone moving rapidly when captured by a distant camera. The enhanced video appeared to show someone quickly approaching Kelsey at her car in an incident that happened so fast it was nearly impossible to detect in real time. The same surveillance system captured a suspicious 1970s-era Chevrolet truck leaving the parking lot, which had entered the area just before Kelsey arrived. When approximately 4 hours had passed and Kelsey had not returned home or answered her phone calls, her parents and John became deeply concerned. This was completely unlike Kelsey, who was responsible and always kept in touch with her family. Greg and Missy, along with John, drove to the Target store to look for her, but found no sign of Kelsey or her car in the parking lot. Greg, drawing on his law enforcement background, immediately contacted authorities to inquire whether his daughter's vehicle had been involved in any accidents, but no incidents had been reported. At 11:17 that same evening, Kelsey's abandoned Buick Regal was discovered in the parking lot of Oak Park Mall, directly across the street from the Target store. Her purse, wallet, and all the items she had purchased were still inside the vehicle. Additional surveillance footage from Macy's showed that Kelsey's car had been left in the Mall parking lot at 9:17 p.m., approximately 2 hours after it had departed the target lot. A figure wearing a white shirt and dark pants was captured on camera leaving the vehicle and running toward the street, though the darkness made it impossible to determine if the person was male or female. However, the clothing appeared to match that of the suspect who had been following Kelsey inside Target. The Smith family immediately mobilized a massive search effort for their daughter. Greg and Missy printed missing person posters and distributed them throughout the community. Kelsey's classmates, neighbors, and hundreds of volunteers joined the search, with the entire community coming together in hopes of bringing her home safely. The case quickly garnered local, national, and international media attention, with coverage appearing on programs including America's Most Wanted. The clear surveillance footage of the suspect was broadcast nationwide, generating hundreds of tips from concerned citizens. When investigators processed Kelsey's abandoned car for forensic evidence, they carefully eliminated fingerprints from all individuals who had legitimate reasons to have been in the vehicle, including family members, friends, and her boyfriend, John. After this process, they discovered unidentified fingerprints on the seat belt mechanism. This evidence would prove crucial in the days to come as investigators worked tirelessly to identify the person responsible for Kelsey's disappearance. Despite the extensive ground searches and media coverage, the breakthrough in finding Kelsey came from technology. Investigators had determined that her cell phone had pinged a tower in the area on June 2, providing them with several potential search locations. However, the process of obtaining the cell phone records proved frustratingly slow. It took Verizon Wireless 4 days to provide the critical location data to law enforcement, despite desperate pleas from Kelsey's family, local police, the FBI, and even the district attorney's office. Missy Smith would later testify that the family had contacted Verizon repeatedly, but the company's lawyers maintained that the requests were not specific enough about what information was needed. On June 6, 2007, 4 agonizing days after Kelsey's disappearance, a Verizon technician finally pinpointed the relevant cell tower and directed investigators to search 1 miles north of it. Within just 45 minutes of beginning this focused search, at 1:30 in the afternoon, searchers made the heartbreaking discovery they had been dreading. Kelsey's body was found in a wooded area near Longview Lake in Grandview, Missouri, approximately 18 to 20 miles from where she had been taken. The medical examiner determined that Kelsey had lost her life due to strangulation. The autopsy also revealed she had endured additional harm before her death. The dedicated website that had been created to coordinate the search for Kelsey was quickly transformed into a memorial site as the community mourned the loss of this promising young woman. The breakthrough in identifying Kelsey's attacker came from the extensive media coverage of the surveillance footage. A woman who had seen the broadcast recognized the suspect as her neighbor. When she also saw information about the suspicious truck, she immediately contacted authorities with a tip. On the evening of June 6, 2007, police arrested 26-year-old Edwin Roy Jack Hall of Olathe, Kansas. Hall was in the process of leaving town with his wife and 4-year-old son, supposedly departing for a vacation, when officers arrived at his residence. Hall's background revealed a troubled history that had been largely hidden from those around him. Though he had no adult criminal record, his juvenile record included assault charges. Hall had been adopted at age 7, but was returned to state custody at age 15 after threatening his adoptive family's daughter with a knife. He had also been involved in an incident where he struck another boy in the head with a baseball bat. At the time of his arrest, Hall was married and appeared to be living a normal life with his family, making his crimes all the more shocking to those who knew him. During his interrogation, Hall initially admitted to being at Target on June 2 and acknowledged that he had noticed Kelsey, describing her as attractive but claiming he thought she looked very young. However, he vehemently denied following her through the store or having any contact with her. Hall maintained that he had been at Target to purchase a gift for his wife and claimed he had no knowledge of what had happened to Kelsey after she left the store. Hall's denials began to unravel as forensic evidence was processed. While detectives continued their questioning, results came back from the crime lab that proved devastating to Hall's claims of innocence. His fingerprints matched those found on the seat belt release mechanism in Kelsey's car. This physical evidence directly contradicted his statements about never having contact with the victim, giving investigators the proof they needed to formally arrest him. On June 7, 2007, Hall was charged with premeditated first-degree murder and aggravated kidnapping. His bond was set at an extraordinary $5 million. The case moved forward with intense scrutiny from both the legal system and the media, as the community demanded justice for Kelsey. On August 1, Hall was indicted by a Johnson County, Kansas grand jury for additional charges of sexual assault. These charges made Hall eligible for the death penalty, which Johnson County District Attorney Phil Kline announced his intention to pursue. There was some legal complexity regarding jurisdiction, as Kelsey's remains had been discovered in Missouri while the crime began in Kansas. However, since Hall had been arrested and was in custody in Johnson County, that jurisdiction retained the legal authority to prosecute the case. On June 13, 2007, Hall made his first court appearance, sitting in shackles just 6 feet away from Greg and Missy Smith. It was the first time Kelsey's parents had seen their daughter's attacker in person. The courthouse was filled with media representatives and community members following every development in the case. Hall's defense attorney, Paul Cram, requested that his client remain in Johnson County Jail rather than being transferred elsewhere, citing the large volume of evidence that would need to be reviewed. When reporters approached Greg and Missy after the hearing, their response revealed the strength and dignity they had maintained throughout their unimaginable ordeal. "He doesn't matter," Missy Smith told the gathered media. "Kelsey matters. You want to talk about Kelsey, we'll talk about Kelsey. He doesn't matter." District Attorney Phil Kline held a news conference following the court appearance, confirming that capital charges could still be filed against Hall. Kline noted that while the current charges did not constitute capital offenses under Kansas law, Hall would face at least 25 years in prison if convicted of the existing charges. The prosecutor also indicated that a change of venue might be necessary given the high-profile nature of the case. As the legal proceedings continued, investigators worked to understand exactly how the attack had occurred. They determined that Hall had likely spotted Kelsey driving into the Target parking lot and noticed that she was alone. He followed her into the store to confirm that she was not meeting anyone, then positioned himself to strike when she was most vulnerable. When Hall saw that Kelsey was preparing to leave, he went to his truck and retrieved a weapon. He waited until she was loading her purchases into her car before confronting her. After forcing her to drive with him to the remote wooded area near Longview Lake, he harmed her further before taking her life and covering her with sticks and debris. On July 23, 2008, during what was supposed to be a change of venue hearing, Hall surprised the legal community by entering a guilty plea to all 4 charges against him. The courtroom was packed with Greg and Missy Smith, other family members, friends, and reporters. The hearing was broadcast live on all 4 Kansas City television network affiliates. Hall's guilty plea came just 1 day after a judge had ruled that prosecutors could still seek the death penalty, following the denial of a defense motion to dismiss the case on technical grounds. As part of his plea agreement, Hall avoided the death penalty but faced the prospect of spending the rest of his life behind bars. The plea hearing provided some answers about Hall's actions, confirming investigators' theories about how he had stalked Kelsey and carried out his attack. Hall had taken her approximately 20 miles from the Target store to the wooded area in Missouri, where he committed his crimes before attempting to conceal evidence of what he had done. On September 16, 2008, Johnson County District Judge Peter V. Ruddick sentenced Hall to life in prison without the possibility of parole for the kidnapping, sexual assault, and taking of Kelsey's life. During the sentencing hearing, Hall offered an apology to the Smith family for his actions. However, his words could provide little comfort to parents who had lost their daughter in such a senseless and cruel way. Sergeant Bob Miller of the Overland Park Police Department later expressed concerns that Hall might have been involved in other crimes. During questioning, Hall had denied committing any previous offenses of this nature, claiming this was his first time taking someone's life. However, Miller's police instincts suggested Hall might not have been truthful about his criminal history. Hall was ultimately never charged with any additional crimes, though he had faced previous charges in 2004 related to an inappropriate relationship with a 14-year-old girl. The impact of Kelsey's loss extended far beyond her immediate family and into the broader community and legal system. The frustrating delays in obtaining cell phone location data during the critical search period led Greg and Missy Smith to advocate for legislative changes. They championed what became known as the Kelsey-Smith Act, which allows law enforcement to obtain emergency location data from cellular providers when authorities determine that a subscriber is in imminent danger. The law has been enacted in multiple states and has been credited with helping to save lives in subsequent emergency situations. In February 2015, the Kelsey-Smith Act proved its worth when a car was stolen in Lenexa, Kansas, with a 5-month-old baby inside. Police were able to use the law to ping the mother's cell phone, which was in her purse inside the stolen vehicle, leading to the quick recovery of the car and the safe return of the infant. The success of this legislation stands as part of Kelsey's enduring legacy and her family's determination to prevent other families from experiencing similar tragedies. Greg Smith channeled his grief into public service, eventually being elected to serve as a state representative and later as a state senator. He continued his work as an educator while dedicating himself to legislative efforts aimed at protecting other families. On his official website, Greg reflected on how the loss of his daughter had redirected his life's purpose. "My plans did not include being an elected official, but circumstances have a way of influencing your life. The event that dramatically changed my life was the kidnapping, sexual assault, and death of my daughter, Kelsey. Nothing I can do will bring Kelsey back, but what I can do is use that event as the impetus to make a difference in the lives of my other children, my grandchildren, and in the lives of members of my community." Missy Smith has also found ways to honor her daughter's memory through advocacy and public speaking. She has provided testimony to legislative bodies about the importance of emergency location services and the need for swift cooperation between telecommunications companies and law enforcement. Her strength in the face of unimaginable loss has inspired others and helped bring about meaningful changes that continue to protect families across the nation. In interviews years after their loss, both Greg and Missy demonstrated remarkable resilience and perspective. Missy expressed her philosophy about the man who took their daughter's life. "I don't think about him. I really don't. He doesn't matter in Kelsey's story. He's the means to the end of her life. But if I focus on him, then he takes more joy from my life, and I'm not going to allow that to happen." Greg found solace in a quote from Abraham Lincoln, saying, "It's not the years in your life that matter. It's the life in your years." And that's Kelsey, and that's her epitaph. It's what we put on her headstone. Hall remains incarcerated at the Lansing Correctional Facility in Lansing, Kansas, where he will spend the remainder of his life. His adoptive mother, Carol Hall, later reflected on the failure of love and support to overcome whatever darkness had consumed her son. "You think you can give them love, and all those things they didn't get, like support. It works with some, but with him it didn't." The story of Kelsey Smith serves as both a heartbreaking reminder of the evil that can lurk in ordinary places and an inspiring testament to how families can transform their deepest grief into meaningful action that protects others. Her memory lives on through the legislation that bears her name, the advocacy work of her parents, and the countless lives that have been touched by their courage in the face of unspeakable loss. Though Kelsey's dreams of college and a bright future were cruelly cut short on that June evening in 2007, her legacy continues to make the world a safer place for families everywhere. The tragedy of Maria Petrova, when inner demons became violence. Maria Alexandrovna Petrova was born on May 15, 1978, into what many would consider ordinary circumstances, yet her story would eventually become one of the most disturbing and tragic chapters in Russian criminal history. Known throughout Moscow as the Zuzino maniac, Maria's journey from a quiet child to a person whose actions would claim 2 lives and forever change several others began with what seemed like a normal childhood in Russia. She loved swimming from an early age and showed promise in athletics, but those who knew her noticed something different about Maria. She was naturally uncommunicative and withdrawn, traits that would later become more significant than anyone realized at the time. Her family dynamics were complicated from the beginning, though specific details about her parents and home life remain partially hidden in the records. What investigators later discovered was a pattern of trauma that began in her childhood and continued into her adult years. Maria would later tell authorities about experiencing terrible abuse at the hands of family members, including claims that both her father and brother subjected her to serious harm that left lasting psychological scars. These experiences, she would explain years later, created the foundation of anger and pain that would eventually explode into violence. Despite the challenges she faced at home, Maria showed academic promise and pursued higher education with dedication. She earned not just 1 degree, but multiple qualifications that demonstrated her intelligence and determination. Her studies in physical education led to a teaching position at the Moscow Electron-Technological College, where she became known as a disciplined and conscientious educator. She wasn't just teaching basic physical education classes. Maria created and organized a weightlifting section for students, showing initiative and leadership that impressed her colleagues. She also maintained her own athletic pursuits, particularly swimming, which remained a passion throughout her adult life. Her degree in psychoneurology added another layer to her professional qualifications, making her appear to be someone who understood both the physical and mental aspects of human behavior. Maria's colleagues at the college saw her as hardworking and dedicated, but they also noticed her distinctive physical presence. She was tall and broad-shouldered, with a muscular build that reflected her lifelong commitment to athletics. Yet despite her outward strength, those closest to her began to recognize signs of the inner turmoil that was building beneath the surface. Maria struggled with social connections, particularly with men, and her withdrawn nature made it difficult for her to form meaningful relationships. The first major turning point in Maria's life came when she reported being attacked by a young man. According to her later testimony, this incident involved a serious violation that left her feeling powerless and angry. She described how this experience changed something fundamental about how she viewed and interacted with men. But the trauma didn't end there. Maria later told investigators that an elderly colleague at her workplace began making unwanted advances and subjecting her to uncomfortable situations that made her work environment feel unsafe. These 2 experiences, she would later explain to police, created a deep-seated hatred toward men that began to consume her thoughts and emotions. As the months passed, Maria's mental state began to deteriorate in ways that weren't immediately visible to those around her. She had been receiving psychiatric care since childhood, suggesting that mental health challenges were not new to her life. However, the combination of past trauma and recent experiences began to create a dangerous psychological pressure that was building toward an explosion. During this time, Maria began to experience intense anger whenever she encountered certain men, particularly those who reminded her of the individuals who had harmed her. On the evening of March 1, 2002, that psychological pressure finally reached a breaking point. Maria was near the Varshevskoye metro station, close to the Shalom Theater bus stop when she encountered Igor Kamornikov. The exact details of their interaction remain unclear, but according to Maria's later confession, she believed Kamornikov was harassing her in some way. Without warning, she pulled out a knife and attacked him twice. The incident was sudden and left Kamornikov, just 20 years old, unable to survive his injuries. What made this incident even more disturbing was that Maria showed no fear of being caught. The attack happened in a public area where dozens of people could potentially witness what occurred. After Kamornikov collapsed, Maria simply walked away from the scene as if nothing had happened. She returned home, methodically cleaned the knife and her clothes, and went about her evening routine without showing any obvious signs of distress or remorse. The police initially treated the case as an isolated incident, possibly the result of a drunken altercation, and had no reason to suspect that a woman had been responsible for the violence. The temporary calm that followed didn't last long. Maria's dangerous impulses were far from satisfied by the first attack, and she began going on nighttime runs through Moscow with what investigators later determined was a clear goal: to find and attack men, especially those who appeared intoxicated and vulnerable. Her choice of targets wasn't random. She was specifically drawn to individuals who, in her disturbed mental state, reminded her of those who had caused her pain. On March 27, just over 3 weeks after the first attack, Maria encountered Nikolai Zhabin, a 60-year-old retiree walking along Sivashskaya Street. Without any apparent provocation or interaction, Maria approached the elderly man and struck him with her knife, inflicting fatal injuries. Zhabin collapsed on the sidewalk and did not survive before medical help could arrive. Once again, Maria fled the scene without showing any concern about witnesses or consequences. The similarity between the two cases, both involving targeted wounds to the same area, immediately caught the attention of investigators. They realized they were dealing with someone who had a specific method of attack and was likely to strike again. The investigation intensified as police began to understand they were hunting for someone who was comfortable operating in public spaces and had the confidence to commit violent acts even when other people were nearby. During the following weeks, Maria's compulsion to attack continued to grow stronger. Between March and April 2002, she carried out 3 more attacks on men throughout the Zuzino district of Moscow. Each assault followed the same pattern: sudden, unprovoked violence targeting vulnerable areas of the body with a knife. Fortunately, these 3 victims survived their encounters with Maria, though they were left with serious injuries and lasting trauma. The attacks took place on busy streets, often with witnesses present, yet Maria showed no concern about being identified or captured. Investigators later concluded that Maria gave no advance thought to where, when, or whom she would attack next. She wasn't developing elaborate plans or carefully selecting specific individuals. Instead, she seemed to be driven by what they described as a manic desire to harm men at any cost, regardless of the circumstances or consequences. This lack of planning, combined with her brazen willingness to attack in public, made her both dangerous and predictable, a combination that would eventually lead to her capture. The investigation took a significant turn when police began focusing on the Zuzino district, where most of the attacks had occurred. The concentrated geographic pattern, combined with witness descriptions and the consistent method of attack, helped investigators narrow their search. On April 23, 2002, police obtained a search warrant for a building in the area where they suspected the attacker might live. When officers entered Maria's apartment that day, they found her in the bathroom, calmly washing blood off a knife. The scene was both shocking and surreal. A woman who appeared ordinary and professional, methodically cleaning evidence of violence as if it were a routine household chore. Maria offered no resistance to the arrest and showed no surprise or distress at being discovered. Instead, she immediately began confessing to the crimes with a level of detail that impressed and disturbed the investigating officers. During the interrogation that followed, Maria provided investigators with precise information about each attack, including accurate dates, locations, and descriptions of her actions. She admitted to the lives lost due to her actions, Igor Kamornikov and Nikolai Zhabin, as well as the 3 attempted attacks where her victims survived. She also mentioned other incidents that she believed she might have been involved in, though investigators couldn't find sufficient evidence to pursue additional charges for some of these claims. Major Dmitry Moronov from Moscow's Criminal Investigation Department played a crucial role in the interrogation process. He took what many described as an empathetic approach, working to gain Maria's trust so she would provide complete and honest details about her actions. Through patient questioning, he helped Maria explain the psychological forces that had driven her to violence. Maria told investigators that she couldn't fully explain her own behavior, but that whenever she saw a drunk man or someone who reminded her of her past trauma, something inside her exploded. She described it as taking revenge for everything she had endured throughout her life. The testimony Maria provided during these sessions painted a picture of someone who had been struggling with intense psychological pain for years. She spoke about her traumatic childhood experiences with family members, the incident with the young man who had attacked her, and the ongoing harassment from her elderly colleague at work. According to her statements, these experiences had created such a deep hatred of men that she lost the ability to see individual people as anything other than reminders of her pain. Maria's case presented unique challenges for the legal system. While she had clearly committed serious crimes that resulted in lives being lost and others being seriously harmed, the question of her mental state and criminal responsibility became the central focus of the legal proceedings. The court ordered a comprehensive psychiatric evaluation at the prestigious Serbsky Institute, where experts spent considerable time examining Maria's mental health and her capacity to understand the nature and consequences of her actions. The psychiatric evaluation revealed that Maria suffered from schizotypal personality disorder, a condition that significantly affected her ability to process reality and make rational decisions. The experts concluded that during the time of the attacks, Maria lacked the mental capacity to fully understand the gravity of her actions or to control her violent impulses. This diagnosis had major implications for her legal case, as it suggested she could not be held fully responsible for her crimes in the traditional sense. When the case came before the Russian Supreme Court on May 15, 2003, the justices faced a complex decision. The evidence clearly showed that Maria had committed the crimes she was accused of, but the psychiatric evaluation raised serious questions about her criminal responsibility. The prosecution had initially insisted on charges relating to 4 attempted attacks in addition to the 2 fatalities, but the Supreme Court carefully reviewed each incident and determined that one of the alleged attacks could not be conclusively linked to Maria, as the victim had not seen his attacker and could not identify her. The court's final ruling addressed several key issues that had emerged during the investigation and trial. They officially confirmed that Maria was responsible for the lives lost due to her actions involving Igor Kamornikov and Nikolai Zhabin, as well as 3 attempted attacks where the victims, identified as Efimov, Cherniev, and Isiv, survived their encounters with her. However, the court removed one alleged victim, VP Kislev, from the list of proven cases due to insufficient evidence. Most significantly, the Supreme Court ruled that due to Maria's chronic schizotypal disorder, she could not be held criminally responsible for her actions in the traditional sense. The justices determined that her mental condition prevented her from adequately perceiving and understanding her actions during the attacks, which meant she lacked the mental capacity required for criminal prosecution. Instead of sentencing her to prison, the court ordered that Maria be sent for compulsory psychiatric treatment at a specialized medical facility. This decision sparked strong reactions from the victims' families and some members of the public who felt that justice had not been properly served. The families of those who had lost their lives due to Maria's actions, as well as the survivors of her attacks, tried unsuccessfully to challenge the psychiatric findings and insisted that she should face traditional criminal prosecution and imprisonment. They argued in court that Maria had shown enough awareness and planning in her attacks to be held responsible for her choices, but the court maintained that the psychiatric evidence was conclusive. The ruling also addressed some factual errors that had appeared in media coverage of the case. The court clarified that, contrary to some reports, the first victim's name was Igor Kamornikov, not Sergei Makarev, as had been incorrectly reported in several publications. This correction was important for ensuring that the official record accurately reflected the identity of those who had been affected by Maria's actions. Following the court's decision, Maria was transferred to a secure psychiatric facility where she began receiving intensive treatment for her mental health conditions. The compulsory treatment was designed to address both her underlying psychological disorders and the specific issues that had led to her violent behavior. Unlike a traditional prison sentence, this treatment was intended to continue for as long as medical professionals determined it was necessary to ensure public safety and Maria's mental health. The case of Maria Petrova raised broader questions about how society handles individuals who commit serious crimes while suffering from severe mental illness. Her story highlighted the complex intersection between trauma, mental health, and violence, showing how untreated psychological pain can sometimes manifest in ways that harm innocent people. The psychiatric evaluation revealed that Maria's actions, while inexcusable, were the result of a diseased mind rather than simple criminal intent. The impact on the families and survivors was profound and lasting. Igor Kamornikov, just 20 years old, had his life cut short by someone he had never met, someone whose internal struggles had nothing to do with him personally. Nikolai Zhabin, a 60-year-old retiree who should have been enjoying his later years in peace, became an innocent victim of Maria's misdirected rage. The three men who survived their encounters with Maria, Efimov, Cherniev, and Isiv, were left with physical scars and emotional trauma that would affect them for years to come. The tragedy of Maria Petrova's case extends beyond the immediate victims to encompass everyone whose life was touched by these events. Her story serves as a heartbreaking reminder of how untreated trauma and mental illness can create a cycle of pain that spreads far beyond the original victim. While her actions were unforgivable, they also underscore the critical importance of providing proper mental health care and support for those who have experienced severe trauma. Our thoughts remain with the families of Igor Kamornikov and Nikolai Zhabin, who lost their loved ones to senseless violence, and with all those who survived these attacks and continue to carry the emotional and physical scars of their encounters with Maria Petrova. May their memories serve as a reminder of the precious nature of human life and the importance of addressing mental health challenges before they lead to such devastating consequences. The tragic case of Sarah Grace Patrick, the quiet morning of February 20, 2025, began like many others on Carrollton Tias Road near Cottage Way in Carroll County, Georgia. But inside the Brock family home, a shocking discovery awaited that would shatter a community and divide a family forever. This is the story of Sarah Grace Patrick, a teenage daughter whose life took a devastating turn that no one could have predicted. Sarah Grace Patrick was born into what would become a complicated family dynamic. Her biological father, Doniel Patrick, and mother, Kristen Brock, had separated when Sarah Grace was young, leading to ongoing custody disputes and tension between households. After her mother remarried James Brock, a 45-year-old man who embraced his role as stepfather, Sarah Grace found herself in a blended family that included a younger half-sister who would become central to this tragic story. The family appeared stable from the outside, but like many blended families, they navigated the complexities of different parenting styles and expectations. Sarah Grace had expressed to family members her desire to live with her biological father, describing him as more lenient compared to the structured environment maintained by her mother and stepfather. In the months leading up to February 2025, 16-year-old Sarah Grace was living full-time with her mother, Kristen Brock, 41, and stepfather, James Brock, 45, along with her 5-year-old half-sister. The family had settled into their home on Carrollton-Tyus Road, where James and Kristen worked to provide a stable environment for both girls. Those who knew the Brocks described them as a loving couple who cared deeply for their children. James had embraced his role as stepfather, and neighbors often saw the family together during weekend activities. Sarah Grace was working at a local Subway restaurant, showing responsibility and independence that her family encouraged. She had also become actively involved in her local church, attending services regularly and participating in weekday activities that helped her feel connected to a supportive community. The events of February 20, 2025 began in the early morning hours when something went terribly wrong inside the Brock home. James and Kristen were discovered in their bedroom with fatal injuries caused by gunfire, having been attacked while they slept. There was no evidence of forced entry, though investigators noted that one door had been left slightly open. The couple appeared to have been targeted while they were at their most vulnerable, unable to defend themselves or call for help. The circumstances suggested that whoever committed this act had access to the home and knowledge of the family's routines. The discovery of the tragedy fell to the youngest member of the household. Sarah Grace's 5-year-old half-sister found her parents in their bedroom that morning, a traumatic experience that would haunt the child forever. The little girl's cries for help brought Sarah Grace to the scene, who then contacted emergency services. When first responders arrived, they found a devastated teenager trying to console her traumatized younger sister while processing the unimaginable loss of her mother and stepfather. The initial response treated Sarah Grace as a grieving family member who had just lost two of the most important people in her life. In the days and weeks following the tragedy, Sarah Grace publicly mourned her parents through social media tributes and memorials. She posted photos and videos paying tribute to James and Kristen, sharing memories and expressing her grief in ways that seemed genuine to those who followed her posts. She participated in funeral arrangements and appeared to be processing her loss like any other family member would. However, unbeknownst to investigators at the time, Sarah Grace was also reaching out to true crime content creators and TikTok influencers, encouraging them to cover her parents' case when it remained unsolved. In messages that would later become evidence, a user believed to be Sarah Grace contacted creators saying the case would be a really big hit, and providing details about how someone came in my house with me and my 5-year-old sister and hurt my parents badly. As the investigation continued into the spring and early summer of 2025, law enforcement agencies, including the Carroll County Sheriff's Office, FBI, and Georgia Bureau of Investigation, worked together to piece together what had happened. They collected what they described as mountains of evidence, much of it related to Sarah Grace's digital footprint. Investigators carefully analyzed social media activity, phone records, and other electronic communications that painted a different picture than the grieving daughter the public had seen. The evidence trail led them to a shocking conclusion that would turn the case on its head. On July 8, 2025, nearly 5 months after her parents' tragic deaths, Sarah Grace Patrick turned herself in to authorities after a warrant was issued for her arrest. She was charged as an adult with 2 counts of murder and 2 counts of aggravated assault in connection to the deaths of her mother and stepfather. The 17-year-old who had publicly mourned her parents and reached out to true crime content creators was now accused of being the person responsible for their deaths. The community was stunned by the arrest, struggling to reconcile the image of a grieving daughter with the serious criminal charges she now faced. The case created a deep divide within Sarah Grace's extended family that became painfully evident during her bond hearing on August 19, 2025. Superior Court Judge Dustin Hightower presided over emotional testimony from both sides of the family, each presenting vastly different portraits of the teenager. On one side stood supporters, including her grandfather Dennis Nolan, who had lost his daughter Kristen in the tragedy, but maintained his granddaughter's innocence. Nolan described Sarah Grace's first phone call from jail as filled with desperation, saying she had cried, "What are they doing to me? Why are they doing this to me? I didn't do anything." He acknowledged that Sarah Grace had wanted to live with her biological father, but insisted that she was better off with Kristen and James, and declared his intention to stand by his granddaughter until proven otherwise. Pastor Ben Bonner from church in Carrollton testified about Sarah Grace's character and recent spiritual journey. He described her as someone who had become increasingly enthusiastic about deepening her faith and becoming involved in church activities over the past year. Bonner emphasized that Sarah Grace didn't simply attend Sunday services, but participated during week activities, asked thoughtful questions, volunteered her time, and even invited others, including her boyfriend, to join the church community. He portrayed her as a young woman who had found belonging and purpose in faith, making multiple calls from jail that showed her continued connection to her spiritual community. Caitlin O'Keefe, a friend of Sarah Grace's biological father, who had taken the teenager into her home following the deaths of Kristen and James, provided testimony about Sarah Grace's behavior during those difficult months. O'Keefe spoke about how Sarah Grace would often be motivated to complete her homework by thinking of her deceased mother, showing what appeared to be genuine grief and a desire to honor her mother's memory through academic achievement. As O'Keefe shared these intimate details of Sarah Grace's daily struggles with loss, the teenager broke down in tears multiple times, displaying the emotional vulnerability that her supporters said proved her innocence. Carrie Jensen, the mother of Sarah Grace's best friend, took the stand to describe a young woman with a huge heart who could never intentionally harm someone. Jensen acknowledged that while Sarah Grace appeared happy on the surface, there were signs of trauma that she had endured within her home environment. Her testimony painted a picture of a teenager who had faced challenges but responded with resilience rather than violence. Multiple character witness letters were submitted to the court from community members, church friends, and others who had interacted with Sarah Grace and found her to be kind, responsible, and incapable of such serious acts. However, the other side of Sarah Grace's divided family presented a starkly different perspective during the bond hearing. Kim Bowling, the sister of victim James Brock, delivered emotionally charged testimony urging Judge Heitwer to keep Sarah Grace behind bars. Bowling and other members of James Brock's family expressed deep fears about what might happen if Sarah Grace were released on bond, voicing concerns that she could harm others or flee the jurisdiction. They argued that the evidence against her was substantial and that the community would be safer with her remaining in custody. James Brock's sons took the stand to ask the judge specifically for no bond in the case. Their testimony reflected the deep pain and anger felt by those who had lost a beloved father figure and feared that his accused killer might walk free while awaiting trial. The emotional weight of their loss was palpable in the courtroom as they pleaded for justice and protection for their family and community. Family friend Kelly Brown spoke after the hearing, saying, "We are very thankful that the court has recognized the seriousness of this case and made the decision to deny bond." Judge Dustin Heitwer listened carefully to testimony from both sides before making his decision. He noted that while Sarah Grace was presumed innocent under the law, prosecutors had presented enough evidence to show she was not a suitable candidate for release on bond. The judge expressed significant concerns based on the testimony from relatives about Sarah Grace's potential flight risk and the threat she might pose to herself and the community. Heitwer ruled that those closest to the case had vast concerns about Sarah Grace's ability to remain in the jurisdiction and not pose a danger to witnesses or community members if released. Sarah Grace Patrick appeared in court wearing clothing supporters had brought for her, and she was seen smiling and hugging her attorneys before the hearing began. However, as testimony proceeded and the emotional weight of the proceedings became clear, she broke down several times and was seen weeping as supporters spoke about her character and the loss of her parents. The contrast between her initial demeanor and her later emotional breakdown highlighted the complexity of her situation and the profound impact the charges were having on her life. Following the bond denial, a grand jury moved quickly to formally indict Sarah Grace Patrick on August 19, 2025. The 8-count indictment expanded the charges against her significantly, including 2 counts of malice murder, 2 counts of felony murder, 2 counts of aggravated assault, and 2 counts of possession of a firearm during the commission of a felony. The malice murder charges specifically alleged that the shootings were premeditated, suggesting prosecutors believed Sarah Grace had planned the deaths of her mother and stepfather rather than acting in a moment of passion or during a confrontation. The expanded charges reflected the serious nature of the evidence law enforcement claimed to have collected during their months-long investigation. While specific details of this evidence have not been made public, authorities have consistently referenced mountains of evidence that led to Sarah Grace's arrest and the subsequent indictment. The addition of firearm possession charges suggested that investigators had evidence connecting Sarah Grace to the weapon used in the shootings, though the actual firearm has not been recovered according to her grandfather's statements. Judge Heitwer promised to move the case forward expeditiously, saying, "I do not want anyone to sit in jail unnecessarily." Sarah Grace's arraignment was scheduled for September 22, 2025, where she would formally enter pleas to all 8 counts in the indictment. A trial date was tentatively set for January 5, 2026, provided there were no significant delays in the legal proceedings. The judge's commitment to a swift resolution reflected both the serious nature of the charges and the community's need for answers about what had happened to James and Kristen Brock. Throughout the legal proceedings, Sarah Grace has remained in solitary confinement at the Carroll County Jail, where she has been held since her July arrest. Her grandfather, Dennis Nolan, has spoken publicly about his concern for her mental state, describing her as distraught and confused about why she was facing these charges. Nolan has maintained that there is no physical evidence directly linking Sarah Grace to the shootings, noting that investigators have not recovered the weapon used in the crimes. He continues to assert her innocence, saying, "She's innocent until proven guilty. They've taken a different view. They're angry and it shows." The case has drawn significant attention on social media and in true crime communities, partly due to Sarah Grace's own alleged attempts to generate coverage of her parents' deaths before her arrest. The irony of a defendant who may have tried to publicize an unsolved case that ultimately led to her own arrest has not been lost on observers following the story. Her alleged communications with content creators, in which she described the incident as potentially being a really big hit for coverage, have raised questions about her state of mind and motivations in the months following her parents' deaths. As the legal proceedings move forward, investigators have indicated that their investigation remains active and that additional arrests remain possible. This suggests that authorities believe others may have been involved in the planning or execution of the crimes, or that there may be additional charges related to the case. The ongoing nature of the investigation has left many questions unanswered about the specific circumstances that led to this tragedy and whether Sarah Grace acted alone. The community of Carrollton and Carroll County continues to grapple with the shock of these events. The loss of James and Kristen Brock has left a void in the lives of their friends, extended family, and community members who knew them as a loving couple dedicated to their children. At the same time, the arrest and charges against Sarah Grace have divided those who knew her, with some unable to reconcile the teenager they knew with the person accused of these acts. The upcoming trial will likely provide more details about what led to this tragedy, but for now, a community remains heartbroken and searching for answers. The Sarah Grace Patrick case represents a devastating tragedy that has torn apart a family and shocked a community. As legal proceedings continue, the memory of James and Kristen Brock serves as a reminder of lives cut short and the profound impact of violence on all those left behind to mourn and seek justice. The John Arthur Gettru case. John Arthur Gettru was born on August 26, 1944, in Newark, Ohio, one of 4 children born to Army serviceman Charles J. Gettru. His childhood was marked by constant movement, as military families often experience. The Gettru family traveled frequently between bases both in the United States and abroad, living in Japan, Hawaii, and North Carolina before Charles was transferred to West Germany in 1960. The family settled in the town of Bad Kreuznach, where John would spend his formative teenage years. He attended Bad Kreuznach American High School, a school for children of American servicemen stationed overseas. It was in this environment, far from home, that the seeds of tragedy would first take root. John's teen years in Germany appeared unremarkable to those around him. He attended school with other American military children and participated in the social activities that defined their small community. But beneath the surface, something darker was stirring. On the evening of June 8, 1963, just before graduation, 18-year-old John attended a school disco where he met 15-year-old Margaret L. Williams, the daughter of an army chaplain. Margaret was known to be a caring and kind person who brought joy to her family. After the dance ended that evening, John offered to walk Margaret home, a gesture that seemed protective and gentlemanly to onlookers. Instead of taking her safely home, John led Margaret to the campus baseball field, where his true intentions became horrifyingly clear. In that isolated space, he subjected her to serious harm before taking her life. Margaret suffered critical injuries and later passed away due to his actions. The attack was so severe that she sustained a major head injury from which she never recovered. Multiple witnesses had seen the pair leave the dance together, making John the immediate prime suspect. When questioned by authorities, he initially denied even meeting Margaret at all. Under continued questioning, he later admitted to having relations with her, but continued to deny causing her death. The Williams family was devastated by the loss. Margaret's older brother, Evan Williams, would later recall the night his family's world changed forever. Their father had driven to the youth activities building when Margaret didn't return home by her 11 p.m. curfew, only to discover she had left just 5 minutes before he arrived. When she still hadn't returned by midnight, the family contacted authorities. Margaret's remains were discovered at 1:11 a.m. The family was so shaken by the sudden loss that their mother refused to view her daughter's remains, choosing instead to have a closed casket service. Margaret's sister Marion Stowers would later say that for a long time after the tragedy, she couldn't believe her sister was gone and looked for her everywhere she went. In June 1964, John was found guilty on all counts and sentenced to 10 years imprisonment, the maximum sentence available under West German law at the time. Because he was tried as a juvenile, the sentence was significantly reduced from what it might have been. After his sentencing, John expressed what appeared to be genuine remorse about his crime and apologized to the Williams family members. However, this display of contrition would prove to be hollow, as future events would demonstrate. John served just over 6 years in prison before being paroled and released in March 1969. The German authorities ordered him to leave the country within 24 hours of his release. As Evan Williams would later observe, they released him one day, and he was on a plane the next day to the United States. It's kind of like Germany going, "Okay, it's out of our hands." This decision would have far-reaching and tragic consequences for families thousands of miles away. Upon returning to the United States, John settled in Reno, Nevada, where he attempted to build a new life. He married a woman named Susan, a single mother with a young daughter named Kathy. Shortly after their wedding, the couple moved to Palo Alto, California, where they lived from 1971 to 1975. To those around them, John appeared to be a loving husband and stepfather. He worked various low-skilled jobs, including security guard, carpenter, and laboratory technician at Mills Hospital. In the mid-1970s, he joined the Boy Scouts of America and worked as a counselor, organizing camps and camping trips. But behind this facade of respectability, John was continuing his pattern of harm. Kathy, his stepdaughter, would later reveal the trauma she endured from age 6 to 14. She described how John subjected her to repeated abuse and threatened that if she told anyone, he would hurt her mother. The young girl lived in constant fear, believing that only his death would free her from the nightmare. The abuse continued until 1977, when Susan discovered what was happening. Kathy would later describe the day her mother walked in on John harming her as probably the most uncomfortable, horrible experience of my entire life. But at the same time, was the best day of my life, because finally, my mom knew what was happening and she would stop it. Susan was devastated by the discovery. I didn't know what to do. I was beside myself, and to just think that somebody would do this to a child just appalled me, she would later say. She immediately divorced John, though she chose not to file criminal charges against him. This decision may have cost other young women their lives. In 1975, John was convicted of harming a 17-year-old female Explorer Scout and received a minor prison sentence and administrative fine. Some charges were dropped after a mutual agreement was reached between John and the victim. Despite these warning signs, he continued to present himself as a respectable member of society. During this period in California, John was working as a medical technician in Stanford University's heart transplant unit. His work brought him into contact with the Stanford community, where he would soon claim 2 more victims. On February 13, 1973, 21-year-old Leslie Marie Perloff, a Stanford graduate working as a law librarian in Palo Alto, called her mother to say she was driving home from work. Leslie was an academic standout who had been accepted to University of Pennsylvania Law School. Her future was bright, and she had so much to live for. Tragically, she never made it home that night. The next day, search parties found Leslie's orange 1972 Chevrolet Nova abandoned near an old quarry's gate. Her remains were discovered 3 days later under an oak tree, about a mile from where Janet Taylor's remains would be found the following year. Leslie had been subjected to serious harm before losing her life due to strangulation with her own floral scarf. The attack was particularly cruel. She had been beaten badly, leaving her face injured and swollen. Just over a year later, on March 24, 1974, another young woman would fall victim to John's violence. Janet Ann Taylor, 21, was a college sophomore at Kenyatta College and the youngest daughter of legendary Stanford University football coach Chuck Taylor. Janet was known for living life with enthusiasm and courage. As the fun-loving youngest of 3 children, she brought laughter and joy to her family. She loved animals and cherished her friendships. On that fateful day, Janet's car was in the shop, so she decided to walk home from the Stanford campus where she had been visiting her best friend Debbie Adams. Debbie Adams would later testify that Janet was anxious to get home to feed her puppy and decided to hitchhike rather than wait. In the 1970s, young women hitchhiking alone was common, especially in Northern California, and neither Janet nor her friend feared for her safety. Janet was last seen on campus attempting to hitchhike to her home in La Honda. She would never reach her destination. The next morning, March 25, 1974, truck driver Ernesto Evangelo was making his regular milk delivery route near the Stanford dish when he spotted something unusual in a shallow ditch. He pulled over and discovered Janet's lifeless form. She had been subjected to serious harm before losing her life due to strangulation. Her feet were bare and dry despite the wet ground beneath her, indicating she had been moved to that location. The discovery sent shockwaves through the Stanford community, which was already reeling from Leslie Perloff's unsolved case the year before. Despite the similarities between the 2 cases, investigators at the time could not link the crimes. The university community lived in fear that a predator was actively stalking young women in their midst. Both cases went cold, and the mystery became known as the Stanford murders. For nearly 50 years, the families of Leslie Perloff and Janet Taylor waited for justice. In 1978, just months after Susan divorced him, John married his second wife, Linda Caputo. They moved back to Newark, Ohio, where they had 2 children. John appeared to those around him as a loving father and showed no signs of suspicious behavior. He became involved in business activities and was generally well regarded by those in his community. His son Aaron would later remember him as someone who taught him to treat women with respect and coached his baseball and soccer teams. "I grew up in a loving household. He was a big part of our lives," Aaron would later say. In the late 1980s, John left Ohio and moved back to California, settling in Alameda County. After Linda died from cancer in 2003, he married for a third time in 2008. He joined the Fremont Elks Lodge, a patriotic fraternal order where he held the position of exalted ruler, responsible for supervising the duties of members. To all appearances, he was a pillar of the community. Meanwhile, families of his victims continued to search for answers. Evan Williams, Margaret's brother, became increasingly troubled by thoughts of John living freely. In the 2010s, he began conducting online research and discovered that John was living in California. Williams contacted the FBI to report his concerns about John potentially committing additional crimes. "I thought because of the particulars of what had happened with my sister that he would commit more violent crimes," he later explained. The breakthrough that would finally bring justice came in 2016 when cold case detective Sergeant No Cortez of the Santa Clara County Sheriff's Office decided to re-examine Leslie Perlove's case. Sheriff Laurie Smith, California's first female sheriff, had made solving the Stanford murders a priority when she was elected in 1996. "We may not have been able to get them way back when we didn't have DNA, but we can do it now. I believe in getting justice no matter how long it takes," Smith said. Cortez was intrigued by the rise of ancestry websites and the potential for discovering genetic material that could solve cold cases. When he reviewed Leslie's case files, he discovered something remarkable. There was DNA material under each of her 10 fingernails. "It was a brutal crime. I believe she fought for her life. And part of that was scratching, biting whatever she had to do to survive. She wanted to live," Cortez observed. The nail clippings were sent to Paraben Nanolabs, a private laboratory specializing in genetic genealogy. After several months, forensic scientists were able to create a genetic profile for Leslie's attacker. The analysis led investigators to identify John as a person of interest. The match had odds of 1 in 65 septillion, being inaccurate. Authorities conducted a surveillance operation to collect John's DNA from a discarded cup. Cortez and his partner followed John and his current wife to a coffee shop where they retrieved the cup after the couple left. The DNA from that cup was an identical match not only for Leslie Perlove's case, but also for genetic material collected from Janet Taylor's clothing by San Mateo criminologist Alice Hilker. On November 20, 2018, John was arrested at his home in Hayward. Aaron Gertrude received the call about his father's arrest while at work. "At first I thought this must be some kind of joke. It was very shocking because that's not my dad. It was like your whole world stopped," he would later say. Aaron and his family were devastated to learn about John's dark past, which he had successfully hidden from them for decades. On May 16, 2019, following additional DNA testing, John was charged with Janet Taylor's case as well. Investigators noted the striking similarities between the cases. Both victims were young women last seen leaving the Stanford campus area. Both had been subjected to serious harm before losing their lives, and both cases showed evidence of being motivated by assault. John's trial for Janet Taylor's case began on August 11, 2021, in San Mateo County. The prosecution, led by Josh Stauffer, painted a picture of a man who lived 2 lives, appearing to be a respectable Boy Scout leader and family man, while secretly being a dangerous predator. Stauffer told the jury that John was a previously convicted perpetrator who had a pattern of targeting young women. He described in detail how John had taken Janet with the intent to assault her, subjected her to serious harm, and then took her life. The defense attorney, John Halley, argued that the prosecution had not proved John's guilt beyond reasonable doubt. However, the evidence was overwhelming. Alice Hilker, the criminalist, testified about the DNA evidence linking John to both cases. The genetic material found on the torn area of Janet's pants definitively connected him to her case. On September 14, 2021, after just over an hour of deliberation, the jury returned a verdict of guilty on all counts. John was convicted of first-degree murder with the enhancement of infliction of great bodily harm. The swift verdict reflected the strength of the evidence against him. Diane Perlove, Leslie's younger sister, had flown in from Los Angeles to monitor the trial. When she learned of the verdict, she said, "Today was justice for Janet, Leslie, Diane, and Margaret. While these promising lives are gone forever, thanks to the dogged work of detectives and the advances in forensic science, I have hope that future lives will be saved and other predators held accountable." Aaron Getru, John's son, also issued a statement expressing sympathy for all his father's victims. "My family had no clue about my father's past and have nothing but sympathy for all of his victims. We only knew him as a loving father and grandfather, but science doesn't lie. With this conviction, I hope these families can now have closure." John was scheduled to stand trial for Leslie Perlove's case in Santa Clara County, but his failing health complicated the proceedings. In late 2022, the 78-year-old John was forced to attend court proceedings from his hospital room via video link due to his deteriorating condition. On January 10, 2023, rather than face trial, he pleaded guilty to Leslie's case, admitting that he had taken her life after she resisted his attempts to assault her. He was sentenced to an additional term of life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. Diane Perlove was present in the courtroom when John entered his guilty plea via video. She said the plea was satisfying because John didn't hesitate in admitting his guilt. "There's justice without peace. There's no peace for something like this. The least I can expect is justice, and that's what we got," she observed. District Attorney Jeff Rosen stated, "Justice for Leslie and her loved ones took a very long time, but it has arrived. This serial predator and murderer will spend the rest of his life in prison." The plea marked John's third conviction for taking a life. Aaron Getru, devastated by the revelations about his father, refused to speak to him after his 2018 arrest. He urged his father to reveal if he had committed additional crimes. "My dad needs to come out and tell the truth. DNA does not lie," Aaron said. He began working with investigators and even developed a relationship with Evan Williams, Margaret's brother. After Williams testified at John's trial, Aaron embraced him. Williams told him, "Welcome to the club, Aaron. It's a small club and no one ever wants to be a part of it, but we are all victims of John Getru." On September 22, 2023, John Arthur Getru died at the California Health Care Facility while serving his sentence. He was 79 years old. No specific cause of death was provided. His death brought a complex mixture of emotions for those affected by his crimes. While justice had been served through his convictions, his death meant that answers to questions about other potential victims might never be found. Investigative journalist Grace Carl, who had covered the case extensively, noted that there were approximately a dozen other cases investigators believed John might have been responsible for. With advances in DNA technology and cooperation from Aaron Getru, she expressed hope that some of these cases might still be resolved. "Hopefully, we will find an answer and we close some of these cases. And we're very, very close," she said. The John Arthur Getru case stands as a testament to the power of persistence in law enforcement and the advances in forensic science that have revolutionized cold case investigations. It also serves as a stark reminder of how predators can hide in plain sight, maintaining facades of respectability while harboring the darkest intentions. The courage of survivors like Kathy, who eventually came forward to testify about her experiences, and the dedication of investigators like Sergeant Cortez, who refused to let these cases remain unsolved, ultimately brought justice to families who had waited decades for answers. Our hearts go out to the families of Margaret Williams, Leslie Perlove, and Janet Taylor, whose promising lives were cut tragically short, and to all those who suffered at the hands of John Arthur Gertrude during his decades of evading justice. The Woman of Seven Faces, the Kazuko Fukuda murder case. In the summer of 1982, in the quiet city of Matsuyama on Japan's Shikoku Island, a 34-year-old hostess named Kazuko Fukuda faced a problem that seemed impossible to solve. Her debts had climbed to over 35 million yen, the equivalent of more than $30,000 in today's money, and her creditors were growing impatient. She had 4 children to support, and a husband who couldn't help her escape the financial nightmare that was consuming their family. What happened next would transform Kazuko from a desperate mother into one of Japan's most notorious fugitives, earning her the chilling nickname, the Woman of Seven Faces. Kazuko's early life had prepared her for survival in the harshest circumstances. Born in 1948 in Matsuyama, she experienced the breakdown of her family when her parents divorced while she was still very young. Her father disappeared from their lives completely, leaving her mother to raise Kazuko alone. To make ends meet, her mother turned to running a brothel from their home, and Kazuko learned early that women had to do whatever it took to survive. The lesson would prove both her salvation and her downfall. At 18, Kazuko was already living with a boyfriend when they decided to rob the home of the head of the Takamatsu Regional Taxation Bureau in 1966. They were caught quickly. Japanese police may not have been intimidating, but they were remarkably efficient, and both were sentenced to prison. For Kazuko, her time in Matsuyama prison became a nightmare that would haunt her for the rest of her life. The facility was notoriously corrupt, with members of the Yakuza crime syndicate paying off guards to drink, smoke, gamble, and mistreat the female inmates whenever they pleased. Kazuko became one of their victims, trapped and completely vulnerable at 18 years old, with no one to turn to for help. When she was released after 2 years, Kazuko married at age 20, but the marriage lasted only 5 years before ending in divorce. She quickly remarried, and with her second husband, Nobuo, she found some stability. They had children together, eventually 4 in total, and for a while life seemed manageable. But Kazuko had developed expensive tastes, loving fine clothes, gambling and drinking, luxuries that her hostess wages at a local cabaret couldn't support. By 1982, she was drowning in debt to various consumer credit firms and personal acquaintances. It was at the cabaret where she worked that Kazuko first noticed Atsuko Yasuoka, a 31-year-old fellow hostess who seemed to move through life without the financial stress that plagued Kazuko. Atsuko always appeared to have plenty of cash on hand, never seemed haunted by bills, and carried herself with an ease that Kazuko envied. Perhaps it was jealousy, or perhaps it was desperation, but something about Atsuko captured Kazuko's attention completely. On the evening of August 19, 1982, Kazuko visited Atsuko at her apartment, ostensibly to discuss their supposed plans to open a snack bar together. What exactly happened in that apartment would become the subject of intense debate for years to come. According to Kazuko's later testimony, the 2 women got into an argument about their business plans. The disagreement escalated into a physical altercation, during which Atsuko allegedly forced Kazuko into a humiliating traditional apology position, kneeling with her forehead to the floor, then kicked her in the chest. In what Kazuko claimed was a spontaneous rage, she grabbed an obi belt tie and ended Atsuko's life. But there were no witnesses to confirm this version of events. What was undisputed was that Atsuko Yasuoka was no longer alive, and Kazuko Fukuda was responsible. In a panic, Kazuko called her husband Nobuo, pleading with him to help her dispose of evidence and claiming she needed assistance helping an old friend escape a violent spouse. When Nobuo arrived, he found his wife already preparing him not to contact the police, which later made him suspicious that the incident had been planned in advance. Together, they wrapped Atsuko's belongings and drove to a remote mountain location where they left her there. But Kazuko's scheme was far from over. She enlisted the help of a distant relative named Shichiki to remove Atsuko's furniture and belongings from the apartment, making it appear as though the woman had simply moved away. Then, in what investigators would later call a supremely unsophisticated scheme, she had another relative withdraw money from Atsuko's bank account and transfer most of it directly into her husband's account. Within a week, the police were investigating Atsuko's disappearance. Co-workers at the cabaret told investigators about Kazuko's jealousy toward Atsuko, and several employees mentioned that Kazuko had been seen with the victim on the day she vanished. When police called Kazuko in for questioning, she came willingly, but made an excuse to leave shortly after the meeting began, promising to return. Instead, she grabbed over 600,000 yen in cash and fled, leaving her husband to face the consequences of their actions. Nobuo was arrested and charged with disposal of evidence. As the pressure mounted and he learned of his wife's affair, he broke down and confessed everything to the police, revealing the details of the incident and where they had hidden Atsuko. By then, Kazuko was already well on her way to becoming Japan's most wanted fugitive. Kazuko fled first to Kanazawa City on Japan's west coast, where she charmed her way into a job at a snack bar within hours of arriving. The next day, she saw a newspaper article about plastic surgery and wasted no time flying to Tokyo to undergo extensive facial reconstruction. She had her face filled with silicone appendages, dramatically altering her appearance. During the 10 days she spent recovering, wrapped in bandages like a mummy, her husband was revealing everything to the authorities back in Ehime Prefecture. When Kazuko returned to Kanazawa, she was virtually unrecognizable from the woman the police were seeking. She worked at the snack bar under a false identity, occasionally making phone calls back home that police couldn't trace due to primitive tracking technology of the time. In one of those calls, which was later recorded and played on national television, she told a lover that she was trying to outrun Japan's 15-year statute of limitations on prosecution for taking someone's life. This law meant that if she could avoid capture for 15 years, she would literally get away with her crime. For the next several years, Kazuko stayed one step ahead of the authorities. She embarked on a relationship with the owner of a famous confectionery store in Nomi, Ishikawa Prefecture, becoming his common-law wife. Sales at the store skyrocketed under her influence, and she proved to be an excellent worker. In one of the more bizarre details of her story, future New York Yankees player Hideki Matsui was a regular customer during his childhood and later described Fukuda as extremely beautiful and kind. Remarkably, Kazuko even summoned her biological son from Ehime, passing him off as a nephew and getting him a job at the confectionery store. For a time, it seemed she had built a new life entirely. But when police finally tracked her down to the store, Kazuko stole a bicycle and made another escape, abandoning yet another family and her son for the second time. The years that followed were marked by constant reinvention. Kazuko became homeless at one point, sleeping in cardboard boxes in an Osaka park. She found work at a love hotel in Nagoya, where she claimed to be 34 years old, the same age she had been when she committed the crime years earlier. But her past caught up with her there too, when the wife of an imprisoned Yakuza gangster recognized her from wanted posters. The woman and her associates captured Kazuko, pressured her with substances, and discussed whether to hand her over to the Yakuza or the police, whichever would pay more. Once again, Kazuko managed to escape. She found refuge at Jiro Onsen, one of Japan's most famous hot spring resorts, where she claims to have learned Buddhist chants and found some measure of peace. By her own account, she began chanting sutras for Atsuko's soul and felt a sense of forgiveness. Meanwhile, back in Ehime, Atsuko's mother continued her daily prayers at the family's Buddhist altar, hoping her daughter's killer would be caught. Throughout the 1990s, Kazuko moved between cities, working at snack bars and hotels, undergoing additional plastic surgeries to further alter her appearance. She adopted various false names, with Kanako becoming a particular favorite. She had the silicone bridge removed from her nose when it became a focal point of media attention. At one point, She claimed to have been robbed of 8 million yen at an Osaka train station, forcing her into sex work to rebuild her finances, though this account could never be verified. As the years passed and the statute of limitations deadline approached, the pressure intensified. In 1996, exactly 1 year before her crimes would be legally forgiven, the Ehime Prefectural Police Association offered Japan's first-ever bounty for information leading to a fugitive's capture. The reward started at 1 million yen, but eventually grew to 5 million yen when Junin Hospital in Tokyo, the facility where Kazuko had received her initial plastic surgery, added 4 million yen to the pot, stating they felt responsible for helping her escape. The massive reward and intense media coverage made Kazuko a household name across Japan. Her case was featured constantly on television, complete with recordings of phone calls she had made to family members during her flight. The entire nation seemed to be watching as the clock ticked down toward her potential freedom. On February 1, 1997, with just 6 months remaining until the statute of limitations expired, Kazuko visited an Oden restaurant in Fukui City for the first time, introducing herself as Rieko. Her gift for conversation quickly made her popular with the regular customers, and she became a fixture at the establishment. What she didn't know was that one of the regulars suspected her true identity and was interested in claiming the substantial reward. The regular customer confided his suspicions to the restaurant's owner, and together they contacted local police. Rather than investigate immediately, the officers told the pair to obtain Kazuko's fingerprints themselves. They organized a karaoke session where they plied Rieko with beer and encouraged her to play the maracas, then secretly collected the drinking glass and instrument for fingerprint analysis. The prints came back as a match for Kazuko Fukuda. On June 29, 1997, with just 20 days remaining until the statute of limitations would expire, police finally arrested Kazuko as she left the Oden restaurant. She was 49 years old and had been on the run since she was 34. She had 600,000 yen in her possession, proving she had once again managed to achieve financial security despite her circumstances. The arrest created a media sensation. Crowds gathered outside police stations, and when Kazuko was transporting back to Ehime Prefecture on public transport, press and spectators lined the route. The dramatic footage of her being escorted onto trains became iconic imagery of the case. But even with Kazuko in custody, investigators faced a race against time. They had to build a complete case, locate witnesses they hadn't contacted in 15 years, and piece together evidence from a decade and a half of investigation. Working frantically, they managed to refer her case to prosecutors just 11 hours before the statute of limitations would have expired. 14 years, 354 days, and 13 hours after the original incident. When Kazuko's trial began on October 27, 1997, more than 2,000 people lined up outside Matsuyama District Court, hoping to secure one of just 33 seats in the courtroom. The case had captivated the entire nation, and everyone wanted to witness the conclusion of this extraordinary saga. Kazuko freely admitted to causing Atsuko's demise, so the central question at trial was whether the action had been premeditated. The stakes could not have been higher. Capital punishment was a possibility if the court found evidence of planning. Kazuko maintained her story that the incident had been spontaneous, the result of a business argument that escalated into violence. The prosecution worked to build a circumstantial case for premeditation. They called Shigeaki, the distant relative who had helped remove Atsuko's furniture, and he testified that Kazuko had asked for his assistance 2 or 3 months before the incident, suggesting the theft was part of a long-planned scheme. An old friend testified about a previous plot Kazuko had proposed involving drugging and robbing customers at a hostess bar where they worked. Kazuko's husband Nobuo provided damaging testimony, explaining that when he arrived on the day of the incident, supposedly to help an old friend escape domestic violence, his wife was already preparing him not to contact police, which made him suspicious she had planned the crime in advance. Former colleagues disputed Kazuko's claim that she and Atsuko had been planning to open a snack bar together, with one stating that Atsuko had actually been saving money to open a coffee shop in her parents' hometown. Perhaps most powerfully, a friend of Atsuko testified that the victim would never have forced someone into a humiliating apology or physically attacked anyone, directly contradicting Kazuko's account of what provoked the violence. The testimony painted a picture of a kind, gentle woman who would never have behaved as Kazuko claimed. The most emotionally devastating testimony came from Atsuko's younger brother. Tearful throughout his time on the witness stand, he described his sister as caring and kind, and revealed the family's 15-year ordeal. "For the past 15 years, he said, my mother put her hands together at the Buddhist altar every day and prayed for the culprit to be caught quickly." He ended his testimony by requesting that the death penalty be imposed on his sister's killer. On May 31, 1999, nearly 17 years after Atsuko's life was taken, Judge Shusaku Tamura delivered his verdict. He stated that the action could not be considered premeditated because Kazuko had not prepared any weapon in advance and had not considered where to dispose of evidence. However, he found that the robbery of Atsuko's possessions had indeed been planned and sentenced Kazuko to life imprisonment for her actions. While appealing her conviction, Kazuko wrote an autobiography titled Valley of Tears, which became a bestseller and earned her millions of yen. She donated the proceeds to Atsuko's family. The book also revealed previously unknown details about the corruption at Matsuyama Prison, where she had been held as a young woman, bringing national attention to the abuse suffered by female inmates. During her appeal, Kazuko's legal team presented a surprising new narrative, claiming that the incident had been motivated by lesbian attraction that led to a crime of passion. The court rejected this explanation and upheld the life sentence. In 2003, the Supreme Court rejected her final appeal, making her life imprisonment definitive. On February 2005, while working in a factory inside Wakayama Prison, Kazuko suddenly collapsed from a brain hemorrhage. According to fellow inmates, some of her final words were about her hope to one day open a restaurant and her desire for her children to see her healthy again. She passed away on March 10, 2005, at the age of 57, without ever regaining consciousness. She had been imprisoned for 7 years after spending 15 years as Japan's most wanted fugitive. The impact of Kazuko Fukuda's case extended far beyond her own fate. Her near escape from justice due to the statute of limitations sparked national debate about the law itself. After decades of advocacy by victims' rights groups, Japan's Diet finally revised the criminal procedure law in 2010, abolishing the statute of limitations for the crime of taking someone's life. No one would ever again be able to literally run out the clock on such a serious offense. The story of Kazuko Fukuda serves as a reminder of how desperation can transform an ordinary person into someone capable of unthinkable acts, and how the pursuit of justice can span decades. For Atsuko Yasuoka's family, 15 years of prayers were finally answered, though no verdict could ever truly heal the wound left by her loss. Their endurance and faith in the legal system ultimately helped change the law itself, ensuring that future families would not have to watch helplessly as time ran out on justice for their loved ones. The strange case of Matthew Ecker. There are moments in life when everything shifts in an instant, when one phone call changes the course of multiple families forever. For the parents of Alexandra Pennig, that moment came in the early morning hours of December 16, 2022. Their daughter, a 32-year-old nurse with bright eyes and a loving heart, had lost her life due to the actions of someone she trusted. But what really happened in that downtown St. Paul apartment would take investigators months to uncover, revealing a web of deception that began with a single lie. Matthew Philip Ecker was born on September 13, 1978, to parents Blaine Ecker and Terry Randall. He grew up with 2 sisters, Molly Hovland and Amy Keller, in what seemed like a typical family. By 2022, Matthew had built what appeared to be a stable life. He was married with 4 children, working as a nurse at a walk-in clinic in Minnesota. To those who knew him, he seemed like a caring father and a dedicated healthcare professional. But beneath the surface, Matthew was living a double life that would eventually lead to tragedy. In 2020, Matthew met Alexandra Pennig when she started working at the same clinic where he was employed. Alex, as her friends and family called her, was a young woman who had fought her own battles. She had struggled with depression and addiction in the past, but by 2022, she was getting her life back on track. Her parents, Mary Jo and Jim Pennig, had watched their daughter overcome tremendous challenges. They had sent her to rehab when she needed help, and they were proud to see her working again as a nurse. Alex was the kind of person who brought light into dark places, someone who genuinely cared about helping others heal. What started as a working relationship between Matthew and Alex quickly became something more complicated. According to Matthew's family, including his mother Terry Randall, Alex knew from the beginning that Matthew was married and had 4 children. Despite this, an affair began between them. Terry Randall would later describe how Alex knew the full extent of Matthew's family situation, yet the relationship continued. For Matthew, this meant living 2 separate lives, one with his wife and children, and another with Alex. The relationship between Matthew and Alex was anything but simple. According to Matthew's family, the physical aspect of their affair ended in the summer of 2022, but they remained close friends. Matthew's mother, Terry Randall, explained that her son continued to support Alex during difficult times. Alex was drinking heavily and as a result had lost several jobs. Without steady employment, Alex struggled to pay her bills and basic expenses. Matthew, unbeknownst to Alex's parents, stepped in to help financially. He gave Alex money and helped her pay her rent. His sisters, Molly Hovland and Amy Keller, weren't surprised by their brother's willingness to help, as they described him as someone who always wanted to take care of people. But this arrangement created enormous pressure on Matthew. He was supporting 2 households while keeping his relationship with Alex hidden from his wife and children. The stress of maintaining this secret life, combined with Alex's ongoing struggles, created a volatile situation that was building toward an inevitable breaking point. On the evening of December 15, 2022, Matthew and Alex went out together to several local bars in downtown St. Paul. To anyone watching them that night, they appeared to be enjoying each other's company. Matthew would later tell investigators that they were laughing on the way home, that everything seemed fine between them. They returned to Alex's apartment at 260 East 5th Street around 2:30 in the morning. What happened next would become the subject of intense investigation and courtroom drama. At 2:50 a.m., a 911 call came in from Alex's apartment. The caller was Matthew Ecker, and he sounded distraught. He reported that Alex had harmed herself with his gun. He told the dispatcher that he had called just 4 minutes after it happened. He explained that he had a permit to carry the firearm and that Alex had grabbed it, locked herself in the bathroom, and fired. Matthew told first responders, "I thought everything was fine, and then she just grabbed the gun." When St. Paul homicide detectives Abby DeSanto and Jennifer O'Donnell arrived at the scene, they found Alex unresponsive in the bathroom. The apartment showed signs of an evening out, with alcohol present and 6 bottles of prescription medications scattered around, including antidepressants, all prescribed to Alex. The scene initially seemed to support Matthew's story of a tragic decision made by someone struggling with depression. Matthew's account was consistent in those first crucial hours. He told investigators that after hearing the gunshot, he immediately broke open the bathroom door to try to help Alex. He said he tried to do what he could, then washed his hands in the bathroom sink, which was why he didn't have anything on his hands when first responders arrived. After that, he said, he called 911, but it was too late to save her. He claimed he had no idea why Alex would take such drastic action. The detectives began their investigation by looking into Alex's background and mental health history. When they spoke with Alex's parents, Mary Jo and Jim Pennig, they learned about their daughter's past struggles with depression and addiction. Alex's father, Jim, told investigators that several years prior, Alex had attempted to take her own life by overdosing on pills. After that incident, her parents had sent her to rehab, and she had gotten clean. This information seemed to support Matthew's claim that Alex had been suicidal. However, Alex's parents painted a different picture of their daughter's recent state of mind. They told Detective O'Donnell that they had just seen Alex at Thanksgiving, and she had seemed to be doing well. Mary Jo Pennig had spoken with her daughter just that evening, and Alex had sounded positive. For Alex's parents, who knew their daughter better than anyone, the idea that she had taken her own life didn't make sense. "Knowing your kid, it didn't fit," Mary Jo Pennig told investigators. As the investigation continued, Detective DeSanto began to notice inconsistencies in Matthew's story. He had told first responders that he washed his hands in the bathroom sink after trying to help Alex. But when DeSanto checked, the sink was completely dry. The sink was dry. If he had said, he called the police right away, that sink probably would have been still wet, DeSanto explained. But it was very dry in there. This small detail planted the first seed of doubt in the detectives' minds. Since Matthew was the last person to see Alex alive, the detectives focused their attention on him. "He's the only one that can tell us what happened. He was the only one that was there," Detective O'Donnell said. During extensive questioning at police headquarters, Matthew maintained his story. He insisted that he and Alex had been laughing on the way home from their night out. When Detective DeSanto asked if they had gotten into a fight once they reached the apartment, Matthew denied it completely. "You guys weren't arguing or anything?" DeSanto asked. "No," Matthew replied. "There's no fight with you two." She pressed. "Not between us," Matthew answered. For hours, Matthew continued to insist that Alex had locked herself in the bathroom and fired the shot, and that he had only broken open the door after hearing it. "That gun went off behind a closed door," he told investigators. "I did not shoot her," but the detectives weren't convinced. Something about Matthew's demeanor and the inconsistencies in his story troubled them. Then they received a phone call from the forensic unit that was still processing the crime scene. What they discovered would change the entire direction of the investigation. Once Alex was moved, they found underneath where Alex had been laying was a round metal piece, Detective O'Donnell explained. The object was shaped like a ring and about the size of a quarter. Upon closer examination, investigators determined it was part of the lock mechanism from the bathroom door. The significance of this discovery cannot be overstated. For us, it meant that the door was forced open before she was harmed, O'Donnell said. This small piece of metal told a completely different story than the one Matthew had been sharing with investigators. If Matthew's version of events were true, if he had only broken down the door after hearing the gunshot, then this piece of the lock should have been found on top of Alex, not underneath her. The fact that it was discovered beneath her meant that the door had been forced open before the shot was fired, not after. The detectives now had physical evidence that contradicted Matthew's story. They believed they understood what had really happened that night. Alex and Matthew had gotten into an argument back at the apartment. Alex, feeling unsafe or trying to get away from Matthew, had locked herself in the bathroom. Matthew, in his anger or desperation, had forced the door open, causing the lock mechanism to break and fall to the floor. Then, the detectives suspected Matthew had fired the gun, and Alex had fallen on top of the broken piece of metal. Armed with this evidence, investigators confronted Matthew again. Despite the contradictions in his story and the physical evidence against him, Matthew continued to maintain his innocence. "I did not shoot her. I didn't take her life," he insisted during interrogations. He kept repeating that the door to the bathroom was shut when the gun went off, and that he didn't know what had happened. But the detectives weren't buying his story anymore. The evidence was mounting against him. Not only was there the issue of the dry sink and the broken lock piece, But investigators also noticed that Matthew had no signs of distress on his clothing, despite claiming he had tried to help Alex immediately after the shot. For someone who claimed to have rushed to aid a person with such a serious injury, Matthew appeared remarkably clean. On December 19, 2022, just 3 days after Alex's death, Matthew Ecker was formally charged with second-degree murder. The charges came as a shock to those who knew Matthew as a quiet healthcare worker and family man. His family stood by him, insisting that he was incapable of such violence. But for Alex's family, the charges brought a sense of relief that someone would be held accountable for their daughter's death. As the case moved toward trial, more details about Matthew and Alex's complicated relationship came to light. Investigators learned that Matthew had been living a double life for years, maintaining his marriage and family while secretly supporting Alex both emotionally and financially. The pressure of this situation, combined with Alex's ongoing struggles, had created a powder keg of tension that ultimately exploded that December night. The trial of Matthew Ecker began in early 2024, more than a year after Alex's death. The prosecution, led by Assistant Ramsey County Attorney Gordon Noblach and colleague Ambrosia Mosby-Velasco, focused heavily on the inconsistencies in Matthew's statements to police. They started noticing inconsistencies that turned this from a response to a homicide investigation, Noblach said in his opening statement. Investigators were called to testify about Matthew's changing story and the physical evidence that contradicted his claims. The prosecution painted a picture of a man who had lost control during an argument and then tried to cover up his actions by staging the scene to look like a self-inflicted incident. The key piece of evidence remained the broken lock mechanism found beneath Alex, which prosecutors argued proved that Matthew had forced open the door before the shooting occurred. The defense, led by attorney Bruce Rivers, maintained Matthew's innocence throughout the trial. They argued that Alex had indeed taken her own life, pointing to her history of depression and previous attempt. The defense suggested that the physical evidence could be explained by other means and that Matthew's inconsistent statements were the result of trauma and shock, not guilt. Despite the defense's efforts, the jury was convinced by the prosecution's case. In February 2024, after careful deliberation, they returned a verdict of guilty on the sole count of second-degree intentional murder, not premeditated. Matthew Philip Ecker, now 45 years old, was convicted of taking the life of 32-year-old Alexandra Lee Pennick. The courtroom was filled with emotion as the verdict was read. Ramsey County District Judge Duran Hilgers, who had presided over the trial, immediately took Matthew into custody. Sheriff's deputies escorted him away, ending his time free on the $500,000 bond he had posted since late 2022. Outside the courtroom, Alex's parents and her older sister embraced each other and cried, finding some measure of closure in the jury's decision. Matthew's attorney, Bruce Rivers, immediately announced plans to appeal the conviction. "The fight's not over," he said outside the courthouse. However, in April 2025, the Minnesota Court of Appeals upheld Matthew's murder conviction in a unanimous decision, bringing an end to his legal challenges. On March 29, 2024, Matthew Ecker appeared before Judge Hilgers for sentencing. The prosecution had indicated that based on the severity level of the offense and Matthew's lack of prior criminal history, he faced a presumptive sentence of 25.5 years in prison. However, Judge Hilgers ultimately sentenced Matthew to 30 years in prison, with credit for 57 days already served. The sentence reflected the serious nature of the crime and the impact it had on Alex's family and the community. During the sentencing hearing, the court heard victim impact statements from Alex's family members. Her parents spoke about the daughter they had lost, the young woman who had overcome so much in her life only to have it cut short. They described Alex as someone who had fought hard to get her life back on track, someone who was loved deeply by those who knew her. The senseless nature of her death, they said, had left a hole in their family that could never be filled. For Matthew's family, the conviction and sentencing brought a different kind of pain. His sisters, Molly Hovland and Amy Keller, and his mother, Terry Randall, struggled to reconcile the man they knew as a caring brother and son with the person who had been convicted of such a terrible crime. His 4 children were left to grow up knowing their father was in prison for taking someone's life. The case of Matthew Ecker serves as a tragic reminder of how hidden relationships and mounting pressures can lead to devastating consequences. What began as a workplace friendship between 2 healthcare professionals escalated into a secret affair that ultimately cost Alex Pennig her life. The investigation revealed how small details, like a dry sink and a broken piece of metal, can unravel even the most carefully constructed lies. Alexandra Pennig was more than just a victim in this case. She was a daughter, a friend, and a healthcare worker who had dedicated her life to helping others heal. Despite her struggles with depression and addiction, she had fought to rebuild her life and was working to make a positive difference in the world. Her death represents not just the loss of one life, but the loss of all the lives she might have touched and helped in the years to come. Our hearts go out to the Pennig family, who continue to mourn the loss of their beloved daughter and sister, and we hope they can find some measure of peace knowing that justice has been served.